Downside Up, Chapter 2, The Playgram. They were looking for a guide to the Downside Up world. The receptionist only had a couple that were free to tour with them, so the couple had a choice then to make, as there were only a few guides then available, and the receptionist offered very little to know about them, as the computers then were down. Where they could choose an older guy, a cold-hearted guy, although he was wealthy. In the past he'd been a serial killer. Then there was a younger guy available. He was much more warm-hearted, yet he was poorer. He had loved many, though, and that was all that was known about them. It seemed weird and bizarre. They didn't want to make a choice. It seemed a weird, compromising choice. But the couple didn't discuss it that long before then choosing the latter. They chose the younger guy, fearing the older man if he'd had a history of killing others. Who went with a guy like that? It didn't make any sense. Even if the younger guy was more ill-informed and a bit over-emotional, but still, he'd loved many apparently, and had good reviews, said the receptionist. So why not? There was no choice to be made. They went for the younger guy. The younger man who'd misspent his fortune. He'd recklessly abandoned it all, but it was on a constant quest to try and love everyone, to too many people, hundreds and thousands. And after his initial promising outbursts, and his declarations of love for them and the whole world and the universe, and he seemed full of energy to begin with, and they felt it was quite wonderful, that it might lead somewhere. But yet he'd abandoned them later on down the path, going off to his next target to guide other people, as he wanted to love everyone and guide everyone, therefore. So he'd left them as he left all the others, impregnated with ideas of love, yet abandoning them so soon down the road. And there were those fearful of apprehending them, of approaching the only others available, those guides that were unknown. Nevertheless, they approached the only other guide they did know, who'd they been referred to. What choice was there? If the younger guy was always abandoning them, and even when they did see him, he loved so many others, he didn't have time for them. Minutes each day, and then seconds, and then only a few days of the month, before only a few days of the year. Less and less time as he met more and loved more. And they wished they perhaps hadn't chosen the ever-loving guy. But they didn't know, therefore, that the other guide was any better, and feared him too. But who knew? So they went out to the other available guide, approaching the grand estate with caution. Like dwarves, they felt small, under the giant arches that towered above them, casting shadows over all. They found him alone, in some outbuilding, where he explained he had been in the past, mercifully ending a number of years of sufferers. He had ended their suffering, and killed them in that sense, but had only done it in extreme situation, and because there were no others available at the time, ending their extreme suffering that they'd had under their instruction, and had only killed those few, very few, and only out of compassion. And because of the accusations afterwards, he'd then later lived as a recluse, and that's why he'd retired away from practicing. Well, one of the many reasons, but a contributing main one for him. And explained that carefully to them, and said perhaps he had some serious doubts sometimes about the euthanasia in a few of the cases, but he did at the time what he felt was right, even if others felt it wasn't, but he felt accused by them, and lived as a recluse because of some of those that accused him, even though many others had supported him. But that's why he felt, because it polarised everyone he'd met everywhere, because they were high-profile cases, so then he had lived more of a recluse as a result of that, he'd explained to the couple, and that's why he had become quite hardened and cold from the reactions of some, because of the way he felt judged by others, because of those practices, when he'd killed people out of sympathy and concern, even though it really hadn't been that many, but nevertheless, it was a taboo where he was, and that he accepted. But he did what he felt was right when he was a young medic himself. Now he was older, he perhaps felt differently about it. When he'd only tried to end people's suffering after all, in extreme positions. And the wealth that he'd accumulated served a great many other people besides himself in any case, and the investments too, most that he'd given away long ago though. He only took out what he really needed for essentials, and maybe a few smaller luxuries, sometimes too. Yes, he did occasionally, he admitted. But nevertheless, the vast fortunes they apparently had, he had no access to really, or chose not to. And that was used for the companies, and the companies that he'd been associated with, and the benefits of many others. Even though technically, only in name were they really his. Not in reality, though. Yes, he'd agreed to try and guide them a little, sure, if that's what they really wanted, if they accept the advice of an admittedly beleaguered older man. Although confessed, he didn't know that much about the place, really, the upside-down world, compared to a vast many of others. He really didn't. But he knew about many of the areas, and much of the upside-down world, or downside up, as it had become known in later years. He had a little experience of going out regularly in a whole variety of different places, even though there were a vaster number of places that no one knew, and he didn't know. And there may well be a lot more people that knew about many other areas that he didn't know about. Why had they not asked him sooner about these places he did know, though, instead of speeding off so fast with his young grandson, the other guide that was available? Yes, he was lovely, but outlandish and a bit far-fetched sometimes in his youthful ways, irrational stories and his over-emotional declarations of love for everything and everyone. Still, he was fond of him, but he was still young at his age, wasn't he? Why on earth did they go off with him and not the older man? Surely they must have... What had they heard about him? In any case, he'd asked them, not sure why they'd chosen the young man over him. Surely they knew that he was madly in love with the world, with others, with everyone, and so driven by those emotional whims and flights of fancy. Dr. Killjoy had been guiding the couple just around the actual outside of the place, just telling them about the rise in the number of cases recently of the clinical happiness that had been recently diagnosed. Lots more of those that had happened. He'd been discussing that briefly to them. It had been a tough year for him. He'd been caught sober while he was out at several parties. He was not drinking in a park, and was found on a street where he was given a double fine because he was too serious and just too sober. He'd even tried to actually stumble about to make it appear that, and thought it was easy to act drunk. He had done before. He just could stop. But no, he couldn't stop himself from walking in a straight line, really. And he was told off for not smoking in a number of cinemas and cafes and bars. It was madness. What was he doing? Going to smoking only venues when he knew that people wouldn't accept that there anyway. But still, he pretended to inhale nevertheless, lighting up cigarette after cigarette, just burning them in an ashtray. Yes, but appearing to chain smoke. Just to chit-chat, so he had a chance to smoke to his friends at the smoke-only bar. Still, it cost him a little bit, and burning all the incense sticks that he'd constantly run out of. Old Dr. Killjoy. He confessed to the couple, though. The confession he told them. He'd never actually been a doctor, and he wasn't that anyway. And he wasn't really that old. He wasn't elderly, no. He was sort of a lot younger. And, of course, he did love parties. And he was really just a young, sad carer. And they'd wondered, really, why he'd claimed to be otherwise, and why he'd been introduced to that, if he wasn't anything of the sort then. Well, it had perhaps overlapped a little bit with that, and he'd been known and called that only by others, never by himself. Only a little with medicine and doctors had he overlapped, nothing more than that. A little, though, sure. And he spent a decade, and then some, chasing after various thrilling experiences, always seeking out the next exhilarating rush, swirling on trips round different continents, capital city hopping, going off on conveyor belts of festivals, and then practically living in different pubs, cafes, restaurants, nightclubs for several years, before going off to house parties for several more years. Nevertheless, he'd lived that many decade of hedonistic escapades of a society, and he'd loved it and appreciated so much of that, even if it was long-term relationships and work and hobbies and other things that were much more lasting joys in later years. And he wasn't really known as being only Dr. Killjoy back then, and not the decades of fleeting experiences in travelling, sex and drinking and drugs, and all the different experiments that he'd done through his youth. No, he wasn't known at all as being Dr. Killjoy back then. But people had not known him then as that. But after his confession to being a totally different person, and a young sad carer, and a young partying man years earlier, or party youth, after the confession of his multiple personalities, then he'd wondered, and he asked them, why did he ever introduce himself then as the Doctor, or as a Killjoy in any case, if he wasn't really those things at all, and were much more other things? And he said, well, that was exactly why, because in the decade and then some after, he'd had to restrain all his desires much more to find the happiness in his main goal, because he'd not really grieved for the sorrows of the past, not truly, not for friends or family or for others that had passed on or suffered. He'd not known of it so much in years earlier. Not that he felt he was that mean or cold in those happier days of his in the past. More unknowing, Matt, perhaps sometimes cold, but much more unknowing about the many sorrows of others, even friends' sufferings that he knew little about in years earlier, even and especially close friends and family, when they'd not known his either. He'd not known the depths of the sorrow either, as well as the amounts, as well as the great heights of their joys. For age, he'd not really had any real understanding of the depth of love or grief, really, that permeated not just his own relationships, but also throughout society. The profound grief that so many others, and all others, experience in different ways. That the whole world of grief he'd really been blinded to for those many years, and decades really. It seemed impossible and unknown, unthinkable, a madness, an unthinkable world he could never have imagined it. Inside the small study were shelves aligning every wall. Each one was crammed with many books. Like people, some were taller, others were quite short, some were wider, some thinner, some thicker. Some had many different colours and shapes and sizes. They were all different, and they were all around them in the library that was crammed in from all sides. The couple was strolling around the old retired professor's rooms, surveying the many of the different titles. One of the shelves at eye height that the couple was surveying, whilst the alleged guide, whatever he was called, denying his own title or changing it. Whatever his multiple identities were, and whatever ones were authentic, the couple watched him tinkering away with teapots in the kitchen while they perused and looked round his books, as he'd asked them to, if they wanted to, rather than sit at the empty table. He seemed to share with them nothing yet, nothing of the downside-up world that they'd come to visit, had spoken little to nothing of it. It was as if it didn't really exist even, really. He claimed to be a resident, though, and he left the visitors surveying his books and the many books and their titles that they were reading, whilst he made them both tea, declaring that it would be unwise to explore further without first a drink and a chat and to get to know each other much more first. After all, he couldn't guide anyone anywhere if he didn't know who he was guiding, really. And then he wouldn't know where or what to guide them to if he didn't know what they were able to do or how they were able to do it. No, they'd have to get to know each other much more, he'd insisted, insisting that tea would be necessary for him, and perhaps if they wanted other drinks to lubricate themselves, then they could have a drink and chat, and a chance to get to know each other, he'd said imploringly to them. After all, he couldn't really guide a stranger, and they wouldn't want to be guided by a stranger, in what was, after all, a strange world. And he said he had the usual questionings that had to be done, the questionnaires, of course. It was a questionary session. They could work through it together as a couple, or him with them, just to guide them through what it was about, briefly. If they couldn't think of anything to ask, yet they still thought of many things, then sure, they could ask him later on. Yet weren't they sure what it was that was really relevant to them? There would be a chance to get to know that during the session. Still not knowing, though, his position within the downside up world, what it was and how it related to him even, nor if he really had any positions at all, really, and they weren't just merely a variety of fictional or made-up positions that were ever-changing. But they didn't know him that well to decide yet. The man of the couple raised an eyebrow and laughed, looking at one of the book titles that he'd been glancing over on the shelves. And the partner laughed back a little too, reading the title, 1001 Orgies, and getting the book out a little. They were rather disappointed, though not really surprised, given his temperament, being quite serious, to see a picture of a woven a pattern of a tangle of planets. There were plants all growing out and around each other, and there was not a person in sight. It wasn't an orgy in that sense then, just an orgy of different plants entwined, their different vines and their leaves entwined around each other. Well, perhaps just a poetic title in a book about botany. Perhaps it was just biology or something, the couple speculated. They hoped, yet they didn't really get it out and open it up to look inside. They didn't really want to open his books up without asking him. He said to look at them and have a look at the books, didn't he? But not to study them. Isn't that what he said? They asked each other. Yet they didn't get it out and open it up, not being sure. Still, it was a wide, large, dominating book, dauntless, and they placed it back amongst the others that were fairly dusty, clearly not been touched for a while. Other titles on the shelf, nearby, sounded possibly weird and like innuendos too. One book was titled In Your End Holes, and another looking book that had serious Gothic script, read harder, bigger, deeper, longer. They were not sure, getting it out, what it would look like, but it turned out it was a philosophy book. When they slipped it out and they looked at the cover on one side, it said simply, The Enduring Struggles of Man and Archaeology of the Body, Mind and Soul. Oh, no, had they laughed, thinking it was something altogether different, perhaps, given that it was placed on next to other books that sounded a little innuendo too. With a line across the middle of the book and an upside-down pyramid on top, reflected as if through water in a reversed upside-down pyramid standing on the ground that the erect pyramid stood firm on. Then again, perhaps that shape on the book, underneath the writing, perhaps that was just to mislead visitors. Who knew what was really inside it? But sliding it back in, nevertheless, so that its narrow binding, its column, then rested and then lined up once more with the other books. Having then looked back over to the kitchenette to the far side of the library, to see him then, stood there, still busy around with the teas made. Still, he had said that they were free to look around, as if they needed someone's permission to keep their eyes open. Oh, well, they probably meant to wander around in the stranger parts of the library where there were long, unknown shelves. Though he'd waved a hand, gesturing to all of the shelves, but it wasn't clear quite how far he was gesturing towards, when he said it flippantly and kindly to them and enduringly. Leaving them amongst the vast collection of books, though, he'd claimed, with some inheritance that he'd collected, he simply could not pass on to others, no matter how much he tried, as if he couldn't have just pulped them all, or burnt them, or shredded them, or something, long, long ago, but just collected them, and they gathered dust. Though not all of them, but many did. The couple scanned over many other titles on the shelf. Making Love and Making Up rested beside another book, Broken Love and Breaking Down, with a third book, each of a different colour, yet with the same bold Times New Roman font and the similar style picture around it. And the third book then, reading Mending Love and Grounding Mending. Sliding this one out, with its cover page, it had read Forgiving Love and Sorrowful Love. With the three books together in the respective colours of their red, purple and green, but with the same font and pictures beside them, there was beside the three a much larger book that was then a love trilogy. But this grander book beside them had a big swirling font with the title Blow the World, though there were three dots then that followed. Because of its height and because of the top of the cover, where it towered over the other books, the top of the cover was then on one side partly visible. The winds that blew the world away were the words above that could be still viewed and read. A partial visible picture then of a house floating over and perhaps above what could be the earth below it, with tops of the trees visible there of the picture. Or perhaps it was a flying house or a floating house of some sort. It was hard to tell, squinting at the picture, and then the words they read, The Times That Lands Forgot. That was the title of a shorter book besides the grander one, and then another smaller pamphlet that read, Bacteria of the World, Unite. We have nothing to lose but our host planets. And from the brief description on the back page, it then stated, humans were to the earth what bacteria are to the human body. Sometimes benign, sometimes harmful, and sometimes beneficial. Then there was a whole series of these books, all that were each entitled similarly but quite different, and these were different encyclopedic books, each towering over many of the other neighbouring books, each beginning with a different word, though each ending in exactly the same sentence. There was How does man exist? When does man exist? Where does man exist? Why does man exist? The How does man exist had several parts to it. How does man exist inside his house? How does man exist outside? And so on. And when does man exist? Where does man exist? That one, when they were sliding this giant out, there was a picture of a star constellation scattered across the blackness of space on the book. Only the writing was in golden colours on its sleeve. Then next to the volumes, what does man exist for? And who does man exist for? Followed by the last of the series, of the Man series, that asked, why does man exist? This last one was in purple, though the 6 books were all different colours, with a large question mark ending each one of the sentences. Then on the shelf below, there were series of oxymoronic books in the oxymoronic section, all different titles that were quite bizarre to them. Titles about different characters, apparently. There was a huge plaque above those shelves that said the visiting characters, and they read the different titles of the books there. There was the foolish wise man, the mean lover, the chaste whore, the lazy athlete, the complicated simpleton, the serious joker, the well sick, the disgustingly beautiful, the joyful griever, the lonely socializer, the asocial friend, the elderly youth, the masochistic effeminate, the deceptive truth teller, the poisonous healer, the lunatic psychiatrist, the God-following atheist. About a person who was unwittingly following God, allegedly, they read from the book title, who didn't really believe in what he was following, though. There were dozens and dozens of the same books, all fairly slim but in different sizes, yet with different styles and font, of course, and a different character was pictured on each of them. The different oxymoronic characters that were called the visitors in the title that was on the plaque above the shelves. Each that they slid out, they then scanned and moved along the shelf. And the studying teacher, besides the teaching student, there was the monstrous angel beside the angelic monster, the robotic animal besides the animated robot, the parental child next to the childish parent, the realistic dreamer next to the dreamy realist, an optimistic pessimist and a pessimistic optimist. There were a lot of these couples that seemed to be stood alongside, next to each other, just waiting to be taken out and then read by someone. Yet they returned each to their place together, seeing a bizarre assortment of these characters, many of them couples, like themselves, and many of them stand-alone characters too. There was the timid warrior, a neglectful guardian, a watchless timekeeper, a politely rude man, a silly academic, an illiterate poet, a free prisoner, and even an odd couple, though they weren't really sure that these could be stories about real people, or whether they weren't just fictional imaginations. How could there be an odd couple? Nevertheless, the lady gotten out a book. She took out the book on the beautifully ugly, and then opened it up at random to read a passage, just randomly. Or was that the book, and the book that she was drawn to? She opened at a random passage, nevertheless. That the scars and the burns and the stretch marks and the shriveled up organs that make the strange sounds and the rashes and the festations and the misshapen and missing parts and the bulges and where things should be, and the alien objects in places they shouldn't, aren't just grotesque and shameful and embarrassments to be hidden away. They're symbolic reminders of the truth, of the hardship, of your endurance and resilience, of the surviving, the enduring, the hardship. Well, she'd read the passage whilst the man had looked over, more looking at the other oxymoronic characters that were stood lined up along the shelves. And then they moved over to the oxymoronic section of oxymoronic events. A different part of the library further down. Different books about oxymoronic situations or oxymoronic places. As if they were real places that were being studied, with huge lengths of many volumes dedicated to each of them. And they looked along at some of the titles there, looking along at some of the events that were referred to. The calm tsunami, the party trial, and then they looked at many of the different places, the oxymoronic places that were studied in the books. There were books about oceanic deserts, barren jungles, flat mountains, and then the dry seas. They sounded like fantasy places, surely. Why did he have dozens of shelves just dedicated to fantasy? Sounded bizarre. The couple had thought to themselves, wondering if they hadn't gone into the home of a pure fantasist sometimes. There were the many more rows of those type of books, of the events, and also many more of those events that they just didn't know about, ones that just had words or symbols they didn't understand too much about. An agreeable argument, an unlearning lesson, whatever those were about, silent musicals, silent songs, and lots of books about these silent songs, shows for the blind, and there were lots of these boxes that were labelled shows for the blind. Dirty washing. There were many different boxes that were labelled dirty washing. They daren't open those, well, many of them were locked anyway. There were other containers that were labelled on the shelves: relaxing work, demanding plays, forgetting memories, waking dreams, stationary dances, as well as even travelling in one place. He seemed to have an obsession with these opposite ideas, with an oxymoronic whole area of the library, with hundreds of shelves, boxes and containers stacked full of it all. Unbelievable, said the visiting man of the couple, shaking his head, the sheer amount of them. If his books were emptying to go by the shopkeeper who sold nothing, if his books were anything to go by, he's like the shopkeeper that sold nothingness. And that was one of the titles of the actual book, The Shopkeeper Who Sold Nothingness. He was about to get into that and read how that was even possible. "Oh, that's an interesting story," said the man, coming towards them now. "It's about a shopkeeper, and collects and gathers many books that he buys, investing in them to sell them on, but he values them too highly in the end and isn't able to sell any of them because of his love of words and ideas, and he couldn't ever part with them." The man explained, describing himself, the other people that he had met earlier on. He was discharging himself of the tea then, handing it over and placing it on the various tables, and then joining the visiting couple. About a woman, the shopkeeper, who ran an ever-expanding shop. She never sold anything, because she valued it all too much, too highly. No one could ever afford to buy anything. She outpriced everyone, explained the man, almost laughing now. It was years ago. Ha ha ha. He laughed to them. She never sold anything. Well, she loved everything that she bought, to be honest. She couldn't part with it, but she loved reading it and sharing it with them while they were there. But she could never sell it to them. No, confirmed the man. Not feeling that ill of her, though. He remarked it of the old book, about the character, as if she was real somehow. Wondering why the visitors chose that particular book. Why were they drawn to that one, he wondered. What did that say about them? Or did it just not mean anything and it was random? They happened to stumble towards that area and didn't really know much about the place they were in anyway. Or did it really say anything at all? Could he have been randomly stumbling just into that area, unknowingly, with his partner? Who knew? He was too busy making the tea to look back and really watch what they were doing and remembering how they took it and how they would like it, following the earlier discussions they'd had. How could she afford to keep a shop going if she actually sold nothing then? I mean, she never made anything. She couldn't be sustainable, could she? Said the man of the couple, a little incredulous at this. Not sure if it was a fictional story or real, though. She just could. Well, she could afford to, that's all. She owned the shop anyway, so she didn't have to sell anything. She just collected it all to sell it. And while she was there, she was cleaning it and getting it ready to sell it more, making sure it was inspected and working condition and legible and, in a good condition, cleaning it and looking after it and caring for it. And I guess she liked doing that enough. But she didn't have to sell it. She was wealthy and owned her own shop. And so she didn't need to sell the things. She owned the shop, had the room to expand it. She acquired ever more things. But I think she enjoyed collecting more things and enjoyed that people just came round and got to look round them for a while. explained the man, almost defensive of the character or the woman that he'd read about. But the woman of the couple visiting now sat down with him at the table, surrounding with the chairs, had then frowned and asked, "What's the purpose and what's the point of having a shop if no one can afford it, though?" She pointed out. No, but many of the customers, they enjoyed visiting anyway. She curated it all wonderfully, and had all the things to be sold arranged in a great order, with countless displays of things, stacked high and in different, multiple different ways that they were arranged in. And it was really like a museum in many ways, and really put together so well, unbelievably, and with lovely music and someone to talk to that had a great love of those things as well, and to guide you what they were. And so, even if she would never allow you to have them, asked the man, he explained it to them almost fondly again of the character. She even put a price tag round her own neck sometimes, and she wore it all the time, on the clothing too. But no, she never sold those, or herself too. She valued everything and everyone too highly. That's just her way. That's what she was. She had a love of everything, and she valued it all too highly, said the man, sitting back now, who'd read the story about her long and well. What? Asked the man of the couple. Fashioned into some kind of necklace. That's what it was. It was just a kind of joke thing to say she was worth $1 trillion things or something. I forget now. She was never sold, and she'd valued herself so incredibly highly, the whole world couldn't have bought her anyway. He'd laughed off. She'd valued everything, including herself, too highly to ever sell anything. Then can hardly it be called a shop? It's not a shop. How could you call it that? Then reassured the man. He really didn't think that it was the right word to use. And the other man he was visiting, the bookkeeper, had shrugged. The book guide had said, well, it appeared that it was. It seemed like it was a shop, and she was always potentially there to sell things. She spent years trying to sell the things, even though they were for higher amounts than she ever could. She just didn't relate to other people's worth of things. But she did want to sell them, and they were priced. Tried to explain the man that it, in his belief, that she did still qualify as a shopkeeper. And what about this one? Asked the woman, handing over another book, a larger book. She now had this one in her hand. It was called The Director Characters. It's about a group of actors, he then explained after a long pause, who are all in a play, and they struggle to direct the play itself towards what they think the audience wants, or needs really, as the goal. And this time the book guide had told them about this, reading a blurb from the back of the book, after some thought, after a glance over it, just to refresh his memories. It hadn't given him a long time ago, so he really hadn't thought about it for a while. Yet they hadn't returned to add it to the next update of the series, not for a long time. Oh, it sounds interesting. Now, I'd like to get into a spontaneous kind of play no one knows the ending of, said the visiting man. Well, began the other voice, wavering now, as if unsure if he should respond honestly. Well, I think those that go into it are trying to get out of it sometimes. There's as many in that are trying to get out as out trying to get in, he finally reasoned, after a little pause, as if admitting something to himself, and then added, as if the couple weren't confused already. The others already out of it are trying to get back into it. Often, if they're out a long time, yes. That's where the last series left off, so I'm not sure if any of them are still into it or out of it. I mean, the characters I'm talking about. It's the last one that was updated a long time ago, so this, it is out of date. Hasn't been updated in ages, he explained, holding the book over to them. But anyway, you should read it first, before deciding if you want to go into it with them. If you do, I mean, if they're even still in it, I don't know if they are in it anymore because I haven't had the update yet. But anyway, read the last chapter of how it was with them, and then you could decide if you want to go in it, if they are still in it with them. He tried to explain to the confused couple who were sort of struggling to get some of the program game. As I said, none of them have. None of them been in contact, not for a long time now. I haven't had several updates from them in quite a while, although I know others did. He'd said, putting the book down and trailing off a while, before showing them now to a few chairs that were then placed around the table, where they then sat down, abandoning the books momentarily, placing them to the side, with the tea then still awaiting them, and cooling down slowly. You don't mean to say the director characters are real people? Asked the visiting man of the couple, after a long pause, thinking over it, wondering if the man was a bit mad, maybe, or if it was some experimental idea he'd not heard of. Well, you don't expect to find fictional characters, fictional people to play real characters or people to directing plays. I mean, a fictional character can't direct a play, can he? Surely, asked the scriptwriter, and he shrugged as if this was a stupid question to have asked. As if he was worried for the man's sanity, even having to ask about it. He was questioning his own, perhaps. No, I thought maybe it was a play within a play or something, began the visiting man, a little defensively, though. It features a play inside a play, certainly, but it's directed by real actors, not fictional. They just happen to be playing the characters that they have to direct. And some of those characters are actually actors who are in a play. Not all of them are, though. It sounds so confusing. I can't get any of that. I should have to think about that for a while and get me head round it all, said the woman of the couple, laughing and asking him to repeat it all slower to her so she could write it down and think about it. Well, it does sound a lot confusing. It's a bit much for me, laughed the woman. But he had explained it carefully and more slowly again, and even the husband, who also had been confused, but maybe not wanting to say that, had been trying to understand it with her more too. It's the book about their real lives, or the characters' plays. Is that what it is? Asked the man visiting, trying to clarify the muddle, as the 3 cups were now steaming away on the table, each too hot to touch, though. Oh, well, it's both, shot back the man, resting now at home, round the large table, taking the heavy book from the visitor, glad to rest it on the table now. It's about their struggle with their own character, and with each other's too, and their struggles with the play itself. Some of it, as I said, is really about the struggles of the characters in their play when they doubt their own existence, or they believe they have been created and are struggling to understand the director's objectives. Were these mysterious other lives, these double other lives, or treble or quadruple other lives, actually the norm, though? It was too confusing. Who knew what was all of that about? The woman laughed yet again. How can a fictional character doubt his own existence? Now that's just being silly, she said, wagging a finger at him, as if he was really either childish and playing with them, or maybe perhaps even mad. Well, a real person can sometimes doubt that they're real, can't they? The man they'd visiting asked back. A real person can pretend, she replied now, seriously, after some thought, but a pretend person can't be real. A fictional person can't pretend to be real, the woman had said clearly to him, slowly, and the man shrugged, as if he didn't know himself that well, or didn't want them to. Yet whilst the other half of the couple, The other man. He looked round, seeing various slogans now posted up around them on the surrounding walls, on the few gaps that were between the crammed shelves of the books. Words and slogans that read, "The future's not what it used to be," was written in a beautiful calligraphy in long floating letters that were flowing ornately, that were hung over the nearby windows, through which spilt in the outside late evening light, or the morning lights in the morning. From inside, you couldn't know whether it was one or the other really, with the curtains all drawn. Not from a glance over there, only through the remembrance of the cycle of the hours of what had happened earlier. Though there were many clocks that were placed around in the room, even if there weren't windows to look out of. They all had so many multiple hands when they looked at them, wandering around the old man's room now. Well, he'd had some weird talk and weird books, and now there were all the weird clocks all on his walls that had multiple hands, some of them, and their dials were all labelled with different amounts and patterns of numbers or weird symbols that no one could read. "You have an interesting place," said the visiting man, once he'd looked over the room more, feeling he didn't want to press the point about the man's fantasy obsessions over fictional characters and embarrass him. Well, he'd been scanning with his eyes, looking around, and then rested finally on the man's gaze opposite, around the table, and he turned to look about himself. "I'm not sure. It's not really an interesting place. I'm not sure. It's the interesting place that has me," laughed the bookkeeper, finally, thinking over it a while, stumbling with his words, and unsure. He practically moved into the library, or was it the library that had gradually surrounded him? The visitors wondered, though they didn't like to ask. As if filling the silence, the man then launched into a long monologue about the couple's lives. They felt they'd been turned downside up over the last few months or years. They didn't know when quite it happened, because there were many people who weren't as they thought or weren't as they felt. And in fact, everyone wasn't how they seemed to be, at least some of the time. Even they, as a couple, the man went on, had discovered they had not really been the couple they thought they were, had not been what they thought they always were. They both had been shocked to learn things about themselves and each other, and about their place and their relationships with each other and the world. And so far, they'd only discovered some of those things in any case, and discovered some friends he'd hidden other lives, like friendships that she'd not known about, and family members that he'd not talked about from long ago. They knew little to nothing about some of their family and friends, and had suffered unknown hardships, and even enjoyed lots of relationships that each had known nothing about. They had secret dreams and secret abilities from each other, even, that over so many years they'd known nothing about. It seemed unbelievable, even though they knew about lots of each other's dreams and fears and hopes and joys, and lots of each other's ideas. But how many things, and vast amounts of things, that they, as a couple that loved each other much, but still were clueless and didn't know about. None of it. All those vast amounts of things. So now, wondered the man, should they trust everything or everyone else? If they themselves, as a couple that knew each other quite well, they themselves had lots of hidden secrets, then how much more did the rest of the world? And how much more did they not know about so many others, in the mysterious other lives, those double lives, treble lives, there could be quadruple lives, and that could even be the norm. And they just never imagined it was. That if their relationship as a couple was still that mysterious, then why wouldn't their relationship to the world and to all others be too? Not even of a few, never mind a great many. Everyone conspired against everyone everywhere. Or was it just those isolated discoveries? Those that were the exceptions, and all the many other relationships with reasonable evidence often to support them and their claims. Was that all dependable, though, credible, and mostly, was it even true? Or were all the others simply just better actors and concealers and hid those things away through a more methodic deception and better at doing that? And that's what the man wasn't sure about. He'd confessed to both his other partner, but now to another stranger, who was only really a brief acquaintance so far. This, in a nutshell, was the man's predicament. He said he didn't know who to trust or how to trust others, when those he knew well, and those he knew very well, including himself and others, the many others he'd known intimately, that all had mysteries, and so many mysteries about themselves. Where and when should he put his trust in others, and those that he wouldn't know? And most importantly, he then gone on to ask, why should he trust others in the world? Why trust strangers, who he'd nothing much to go on anyway, when he'd sometimes gotten his own close friends and family, and even himself, so wrong? If he could make mistakes there, then how many more mistakes could be made elsewhere? When he got in his own partner, himself, so wrong over the years. And seeing through more of his own illusions in recent times, then why should he even trust himself? If he was so mistaken in the past, then why not about the present? And perhaps he would continue to be mistaken always in the future. Then he could never even trust himself, nor anything else. And what could he ever trust? Wholly and truly. Yes, he could trust himself some of the time, and could trust some other people some of the time, sure. But he could trust nothing and no one all the time. Nothing was completely trustworthy and perfect and infallible. Everything, including himself, confessed the man in the couple, would let you down and let everyone down. So who can I trust wholly, if nothing and no one? Asked the man to the two now. I feel that we do know a lot about our friends and family and ourselves, said the couple, the other woman in the couple. We still trust each other sometimes, a lot of the time, began the woman now, playing her own part in the first session, trying to defend the relationship. It wasn't that mysterious, she felt. They had known each other really well, in a lot of different circumstances, and in many different sad and very happy occasions too. In many things, I still trust you with a lot of things, she added, seeing the serious furrow, his raised eyebrow, on her partner's face, that he was a little bit confused and quite serious. Okay, not with all the credit cards, she admitted, or with the drink always, she added, or with other things, she said, but then seeing his grimace, she'd said, but there were many things I do trust about you, though. It was one thing mentioning the overspending and the drunkenness in their argument as a couple, but another casually bringing it up to a stranger or a very new acquaintance, however determined to understand that he claimed to be. She did not go on with a list of her suspicions and her worries, though. I trust you with my heart. I trust you with the children, she said, still seeing his grimace, after her misspending accusations at him in front of a near stranger. But I trust you in mine too, and my heart, said the man, though he said it after a longer pause. Even if I don't trust your friends sometimes, but I think you are lovely and you're kind, and I trust your value in other things. He'd said this after a longer pause and a lot of thought. I always said she's too nice, he then said to the new acquaintance. You're just too trusting to other people. I trust you, just not all your friends. the husband of the group had then said to the other stranger, who was still present, the acquaintance, as he was now getting to meet the couple and know them more. Well, I still do trust you a lot. I trust a lot of the friends and family, she said, as if continuing some earlier discussion. Just because I was wrong about some of them, I was still right about many, she claimed. And the husband was then weighing this up, discerning. Yeah, maybe, he said, in another wavering pitch, with his yes sounding more like a maybe, and shrugging. We were wrong about each other on a lot of things, even if we got each other right sometimes. Sometimes. So why can't it be like that with our friends? The woman in the couple had then said to the friend, and also to her partner too. She asked this to the partner, both sat close to them, with him listening. I do trust our friends, the partner then replied. But it's your friends sometimes I got the doubts about. I don't know them as well, do I? He said defensively. It's your friends I got my doubts about. I was right about the others, said the husband. A few of the others, some of them, and not the others. Not all of them, she shot back. You knew nothing about the rest of them, the wife had replied abruptly. And then he nodded, a little, silently, as if there was still much unsaid about it. With the other then witnessing and watching, and noticing they hadn't got too angry, though. That what makes me more worried. It makes me more worried, complained the man. Then he said this to the over-listening other. I mean, yeah, I suspected a few. They couldn't have hidden it so well, perhaps, all of the time, not after so long, when we lived and started working together more. But I don't know about the rest, so that's what makes me worried about it. Well, why worry when so many of our mutual friends we do love and get along with, and we have a lot of friends? The wife had also said, and explaining that still to them both.